Thanks for joining the program.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Let's start with for my listeners by taking some time to get to know you. You're an objectivist. You've written several books. You've worked for the Ayn Rand Institute for I think you worked for a think tank for a little while. Tell me a little bit about your journey, how you came to be an objectivist, and tell me a little bit about how you got into tell me about the trajectory of your career.
I was always interested in ideas. I remember I took martial arts as a kid, and I remember enjoying more than anything the part of the class where we'd sit down at the end and like our teacher would drop like these Zen sayings and whatever. So I was very primed for philosophy by the time I became a teenager. And then I guess when I was 13, I decided, well, I should probably figure out which religion is true. And so I went on the internet, and for some reason, like I discovered some essay or speech transcribed on atheism. And it was very pro-reason and anti-skepticism. And for some reason, like that immediately, I was like, yeah, that's definitely right. And then it was like a year or two later that through a kind of winding trail we need not go down, that I discovered Ayn Rand. And she certainly was pro-reason, anti-religion, anti-skepticism. So I thought that's great. But she was also seriously interested in morality and thought that you could have a rational morality. And that to me was like hitting the jackpot. It was like, oh, like you can use your mind actually to guide your life, and it's not just kind of this fun exercise that I'm doing as a hobby. It really can and should be the centerpiece of how you live. And so I spent, from the age of 15 until I guess about 23, just learning about these ideas on my own, writing about them online, on like old Usenet boards, and then the early blogging universe. And I got to know the Ayn Rand Institute because I was taking classes from them starting around 2005. And so in 2006, they were looking for a writer and asked me to joined. And my interest in philosophy has always been predominantly epistemology. How do we know? And ethics. How should we live? The job assignment there was, we want like political cultural commentary because we're trying to actually like change a culture. And so I got really involved in doing that, but I didn't really have a particular focus. And then with the 2008 financial crisis, it became, wow, things can go bad really fast, like a lot faster than I thought. So I spent a year just trying to learn economics on my own. And for the rest of the time at ARI, my main function was writing about capitalism, business, economic issues from an objectivist perspective. Then in 2017, I reached a point where I felt like, all right, I'm not growing and learning as quickly as I want. And so I went and worked with a longtime friend and mentor, Alex Epstein, who had written a book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, that I had contributed to editing. And the book had become very successful. He was very influential and had the skill set of being extraordinarily good at persuasion, taking people who expect to disagree with you over a controversial issue and actually winning over hearts and minds. And then he also was very entrepreneurial. Like he had started a for-profit think tank that was doing incredibly well. And part of my view is that, at least for me, but I think for many intellectuals, the best situation is not to be in an organization, but to be independent. And so I wanted the skill set so that one day I could be independent. And so since last June, that's what I've been doing. And it takes many forms, but essentially what I do is I help people whose ideas I support, who are trying to promote those ideas, become more effective. So that might just be like creating videos on how to be a better communicator. It can be like editing stuff for them or creating content for them. But I mean, the way I think about it, if you want a label for my job, there's the job of the public intellectual who's like speaking to the public about their ideas. I really think of it as I'm a private intellectual. That is, if you know anything about fighting, there's the Mike Tysons and Pacquiaos of the world, and they're kind of the stars. But then there's Freddie Roach, who trains all the stars. And that's sort of like my ideal position. Is sometimes I do stuff that's more public facing, but I'm just more interested in helping people with whom I have a certain agreement become better champions of our shared ideas.
Has that been scary, going out on your own and not being attached, let's say, to a large financially backed institution? Is it what advice do you have for people who are trying to go out on their own and become freelancers or entrepreneurs, where nothing's guaranteed at the end of the day, and it all comes down to your ability to scramble? I suppose there's a certain amount of that that's true even if you work for a company. You have to produce, you have to make your company money, or else you're out on your butt. But at the same time, there's a certain sense in which you're not surrounded by a kind of network of people that you're surrounded by that are, you're kind of a lone wolf here. How has that been?
There's definitely elements of it that are scary, but part of what you realize is that the security of having a job is very, like, that's pretend security, right? Because basically you're all in on one company that if they don't like you, or if they have trouble, or their needs change or something like that, then you've gone from everything to nothing. And part of what going out on your own does is it gives you more control so that you can diversify against downside, and then of course enjoy upside. So there's definitely scary things about it. And it wasn't clear when I did it that things were going to work out. And thankfully they worked out very quickly, and they worked out better than I could have ever anticipated. But I would say that's part of the mentality you have to cultivate. Part of it is you want to build an entrepreneurial skill set as well as an intellectual skill set. And there's a lot we could talk about there if you want to get into it. But the other thing is just remembering that there's no such thing as security. Now, it is true, like in academia, you only have to sell yourself once, right? And that's not exactly true, but it's more or less true that you basically have a handful of people that everybody's an entrepreneur. They just typically have one customer, right? And what I'm just encouraging is be open to the possibility that maybe you could win over more than one customer and have full control over your career in a way that you can't at an organization. Organizations are good, and some people they're a great fit for, but certainly for me, I want full control over my life, or at least as much control as I can have. And being able to work for myself has just been key to that.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and as a teacher, I've always seen myself as a tradesman. And I think the reason is I think it's a psychological reason, is that I never want to get too attached to my institution. I like to see myself as a lone, skilled craftsman or tradesman who is very good at teaching, and it comforts me, this idea that my skills will always provide value. There's always going to be, actually, I mentioned this in a minimum wage argument I was having with another teacher, and I asked this teacher, okay, well, why don't you make minimum wage? Because he was, of course, talking about the fear that if we lost the minimum wage, everyone would be working for Jeff Bezos or something like that in his little dungeon. They'd be slaves of the capitalists or something like that. And I said, why don't you make minimum wage right now? And the person I was talking to just went, oh, because I wouldn't accept it, and because I'm more valuable than that. Oh yeah. And I do like to think of myself like that, is that yes, I do work for an institution, but I have a skill that I'm not going to lose anytime soon, and I can take it with me. And that's always been really comforting. I want to switch over to your values. You've actually, and I also wanted to tell you how I found out about you for the first time. I think it was like 3 years ago. You were on the Rubin Report, and I became really interested in what you were saying. And I then went and picked up your book with Yaron Brook, Equal is Unfair. And I really started at that point getting more into libertarian economics and Ayn Rand. I started rereading her canon. You've been a pretty ardent defender of free market capitalism, right? You're a radical for capitalism. Can you tell my listeners what is capitalism, and why would you argue that capitalism is the most moral form of economic organization?
I find it really helpful to approach this question with historic context. So if you think about like what predated capitalism, I mean, the major system in Europe was feudalism. And in feudalism, what you have is it's a status-based society where there's a handful of politically and economically powerful elites who basically exploit everybody else, and who everybody else is sort of trapped in the role more or less of farmer. And it's a system of incredible poverty, except for the people at the top. But what happens is, starting in with the Renaissance, but really at the time of the Enlightenment, you get a movement towards freedom, intellectual freedom, political freedom, economic freedom. And so you start getting the liberation of these chains, and you start, as a result, seeing something new, which is an increasing division of labor. New forms of technology arise, new forms of, or new levels of wealth, particularly wealth of people who are not already the kind of established elites. And then with the discovery of low cost, reliable energy, first through coal and then through oil, you get a real explosion of wealth, because what happens is that we transition from a physical labor society to a machine labor society. And so we get our machines to go around, do our work for us, or do a lot of our work for us, liberate us to be able to do more intellectual labor instead of physical labor. And so I'm sure most of your listeners have seen these graphs of, like, world GDP per capita, and it's kind of more or less flat with a little bit of an increase. And then it turns like a hockey stick off to the races. And that is the results of, once you've liberated people to think and to govern their economic affairs by their minds, then you get a transformation in our ability to flourish. And so what happens is that people look around, and there's a real recognition during the 19th century of, like, this is a new phenomenon. It's a new kind of system that didn't exist before. And you could have thought of, like, the political system would often be referred to as liberalism, not liberalism, obviously, in the modern sense. Today, sometimes it'll be put as classical liberal, which I don't really like, because it makes it sound too, like, ancient, where it's really the system of progress in the future. So there's this new system, and I mean, Marx is the one who labels it capitalism. And the way that Ayn Rand defines it, which I think is clarifying, though this is not how people were defining it at the time, which is part of the problem, is she defines it as a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, where all property is privately owned. And that's kind of like an essentialized view of what capitalism is. But because it emerges not exactly accidentally, but not fully consciously, and because it emerges from systems that were deeply authoritarian and oppressive, we don't ever get a full disentangling of this new system from the old system. It inherits a lot of bad things, including government interaction or engagement with business, both in terms of, like, controls that say, no, you can't do certain things, but also you can think of collaborations. We'll give you special favors and you'll kind of do our dirty work for us. So there's some of that. Of course, there's the inheritance of slavery, which meant that there is a huge portion of the population that did not enjoy this freedom and did not enjoy this wealth. So, but you can nevertheless say that for a important, an unprecedentedly high percentage of the population, they had an unprecedented amount of freedom, and that this led to an unprecedented amount of flourishing. And so the question is, what happened next? And what happened next is that, far from people defining the nature of this new system and providing it with a philosophic basis for why we should value this system, why it's good. Instead, it basically gets defined by its attackers, by Marx, other socialists, other forms of collectivism later in the 20th century. And the defenders are hopeless. They make some contributions to our understanding of economics, though when it comes to morally defending this new system, they basically have nothing to say, or often worse than nothing to say. And so then the question is, well, what is the nature of the attack on capitalism? And then what is the nature of the reason that I think it's worth defending? And I'll just give the kind of Cliff Notes version, which is that there's a view that what capitalism is doing is unleashing selfishness. And if you think, what is the conventional view of selfishness? Well, it's the short range, seeking out the gratification of your desires, often your materialistic desires. So it's the system of unhinged greed. And therefore, it's the system that pits individuals against each other. And so if feudalism was exploitation by the politically powerful. Capitalism is exploitation by the economically powerful. That's how it's viewed. It's fueled by selfishness that means this kind of cutthroat dog eat dog way of life. And in effect, Ayn Rand's answer, which I agree with, is yes, capitalism does unleash and reward selfishness, but not in the conventional way of thinking about it. So we can talk about Ayn Rand's view of selfishness, but what we can say is there's kind of a caricature that she's pointing at the thing that we call selfishness and saying, when we say it's bad, she goes, no, it's good. And of course, if she did that, then nobody would have paid attention to her. What she's doing is saying, what you think selfishness is, you got all wrong. That what it really means to be genuinely concerned with your well-being, your happiness, your success in life is, first of all, being committed to reason, being committed to long-range success and happiness, that the essence of how you achieve success and happiness is through being a producer, being a creator, creating wealth, not just like, or not seizing it from others, not exploiting others. And that the nature of selfish relationships is one of harmonious interests. So she thinks the essence of human interaction and moral interaction and selfish interaction is what she calls the Traitor Principle. And obviously in economics, anytime you buy and sell with somebody, anytime you hire somebody, these are all in a system of voluntary interaction people engage in because they find, yeah, we both gain by this interaction. Like the seller loves you handing him the money and you love him handing you, your copy of the latest Stephen King book. You both come away better off. But she also thinks that there's spiritual trade that's involved in things like friendship and romance. So it's not like, hey, somebody mowed the lawn for me, so I'll go to dinner with them. And, maybe next week, like they'll do me some other favor. It's that we take a deep selfish enjoyment in just the sheer fact of a person's existence, right? Because the kind of pleasure of sitting with a friend and discussing ideas or having a meal, these are spiritually enriching. And she thinks that proper human relationships are a trait in that sense. So what she's for is rational selfishness, neither sacrificing yourself to others nor others to yourself. And she's saying that's what capitalism unleashes and protects. And that, in essence, is the moral case for capitalism.
Yeah, some of what you were saying not only, of course, reminded me of the tale that Pinker weaves in his Enlightenment Now, but also I was thinking about a TED talk that Jonathan Haidt gave. It was called something like 3 Stories About Capitalism or something like that. And he gives the story from the left of what capitalism is, a kind of straw man of capitalism. And when my students talk about capitalism, they immediately start reciting sort of cliches about robber barons and unfair labor practices and things like that. And what became clear to me is that they see capitalism as the oppressive force that we need to be liberated from. And it doesn't seem to matter how many arguments I make about capitalism simply being government leaving you free to engage in voluntary, mutually beneficial transactions, and not coercing you and not harassing you, but just capitalism is just freedom, right? And I'll even cite when I'll teach Animal Farm in school, and we'll talk about the Soviet Union, and we'll talk about the fact that Marxism, when it's implemented, it doesn't work everywhere it's tried. Always, it doesn't work. And I even give them examples like when Lenin, for example, had to pull back on the Marxism and implement capitalism and property rights and allow people to trade. And then the economy would come roaring back. And then he would go back to Marxism once the economy was fixed from the Marxism that had screwed up the economy and created famine. So, and it just goes in one ear and out the other. People just seem wedded to this narrative of capitalism we need to be liberated from capitalism. Whereas I've always seen capitalism as being freedom, negative liberty, freedom from government coercion, price fixing, and all of this stuff. So how do we tell a better story about capitalism that reaches young people? Capitalism is more progressive than socialism. I often tell students in my philosophy class when we're studying like Ayn Rand, I will say that someone like Ayn Rand would say that capitalism is actually more progressive, right? Creative destruction, right? And it seems to not reach anyone. I think the sort of zeitgeist right now is too powerful. What do we do about that?
Well, first of all, you have to respect why it's happening. So it's often easy to tell ourselves kind of stories that put the blame on other people. It's like, oh, they're too stupid, they're too irrational, they're too dishonest. And sometimes that's true. And certainly I think for a lot of the like professional intellectuals who are anti-capitalism, like they know the history of communism. They know the history of every variant of statism and the total and utter failure. And if they don't know, they have a moral responsibility to know. So that doesn't excuse them. But for most people, I think that it's mainly is an issue that we haven't been persuasive enough. And but in order to understand why, you have to respect the nature of the problem, which is it sounds like you've had this experience where you knock down one of these gophers or whatever, and then 5 more pop up, right? 5 more objections pop up, and that is indicative that what's operating is a whole worldview. So they have a whole entrenched context of um, philosophic, journalistic, economic, historic. They have this whole rich network
Right.
of things that are propping up the view of capitalism as bad. And so,
Ready-made slogans like crony capitalism. And I'll say, cronyism is not capitalism. This is government corruption. And they go, no, it's crony capitalism. You know
yeah,
what I'm saying?
no, absolutely. And so, I mean, there's a lot to say in how you deal with that, but I'll name 2 aspects. So, one is to realize that there's that rich context of knowledge that's pushing up against your new view is really built on a kind of core framework of goals, or you could put it as values, assumptions, and methods. And by here, I mean thinking methods. How should we process different kinds of arguments and answer different kinds of questions? And that a framework is basically kind of like the leverage point in people's understandings. That if you give them a better framework, then you don't have to address the million things that are wrong. And let me give you an example, which is, so if you think, how do we tell a better story of capitalism? Well, the best story of capitalism is Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand's novel. And if you think, why is that novel able to change so many minds in such a fundamental way? Well, part of it is that it's giving you a new worldview. It's conveying, in other words, a new framework for seeing the world. And that if you get and that if you can get people to embrace a better framework, then it's not like you have to answer every one of those issues, or rather you do have to answer all of them. But what happens when people are persuaded of a new worldview, or where they're willing to entertain a worldview, is they start out basically trying to push against it because it's a pain in the ass to embrace a new worldview. Worldviews like to be stable. And so they first look for reasons to dismiss it. Totally reasonably, right? Like if you really had to go and like reconsider all of your views all the time, you couldn't live. But if they get to glimpse that no, there's really something to contend with here, then they'll start looking into it and raising questions. And then once they start to think, yeah, this worldview is true, or it's probably true, then it's that they'll be actively looking for the solutions. And I don't necessarily mean they're kind of like loading the dice and saying, oh, how do I defend my view? I'm not willing to entertain that it might be wrong, but rather they're on the premise of, no, this is probably right. I put a lot of work into understanding it. So how would this new framework deal with these kinds of different sorts of cases or historic claims or whatever they are? And so what I'm saying is that what really needs to happen is that people need a better framework. And this is part of Ayn Rand's view, is that what she's doing is giving the framework that capitalism needed and never had. So it's a framework that understands capitalism through the lens of a pro-reason, pro-individualist worldview that had never been fully articulated. So if you think that capitalism comes out of Enlightenment thinking had never been able to fully articulate a case for reason, for if you want to put it selfishness, but the way to think about it is more individual flourishing, something like that, and having fully firm foundations then for political freedom. And so all of that really needed to be established, and that's what she sees herself as doing, and that's my view, is that she did effectively.
Yeah, and I was listening to your one of your podcast episodes with Yaron Brook, and the episode was all about communicating. And I think it was you who actually made this point that sometimes it's not as effective to start with. I mean, I tend to be a very systematic thinker. So I want to start with like John Locke, and I want to talk about, I want to strip things down to a state of nature and talk about the fact that we all share the earth in common. And then what is the first right that every other right springs forth from? And then this is what I do when I teach natural rights theory. I teach a philosophy class, and I start with, well, you have a right to your own life, and then if you have a right to your own life, you have a right to your own body, and then you have a right to your labor, and then you have a right to the fruits of your labor, and then you can mix your labor with the land. Then I explain property rights. That doesn't seem to be very effective. It's just starting from scratch and building up piece by piece, with utterly rational steps that almost cannot be challenged. Or if they are challenged, I have good reasonable responses. I have ready to go solid arguments. I'll bring Nozick in, and I'll make these arguments. And it doesn't seem to work that way. And I think you were making this point on your podcast that sometimes it's better to pick an issue that people are jazzed up about and do it backwards, think backwards and say, look how outraged you are about this issue. Now let's see how this all comes down to property rights or something like that. Do you want to elaborate on that idea? This was a couple episodes back on your show that you were explaining this.
Well, I don't remember exactly what I said there, but there's definitely an important point here, which is you have to think of it from the student's perspective, which is, look, we all know what the right kind of politics are. And like, we have disagreements, sort of like, what should we do about healthcare? What should we do about energy? But like, you're raising, like, what question are you even raising, and why are you raising it? And that is actually the whole point of philosophy. So, and it's why philosophy is hard to sell people on. So if you think about what philosophy is, and you're doing political philosophy, philosophy is the recognition that whenever we're thinking and whenever we're acting, we're making certain assumptions. And what philosophy is doing is bringing those assumptions to the surface so that we can critically think about them and say, are they true? And then hold them consciously in awareness through the rest of our thinking and action, so that we're acting with full control over our mind and our life, or at least the most control that one can have over one's life. And think about Socrates, right? What was his big innovation? Is people were walking around saying this is just and that's unjust. And he said, well, what the hell is justice? And they said, I don't know. And that there was a real live question here. But part of what they pushed back on was, Socrates, that's dumb. We all know what justice is. You're kind of convoluting things. You're like, this has nothing to do with real life. Like, we're getting by fine without your advice. And so that's always there's a suspicion, or there's a kind of bewilderment of, like, why are we talking about a state of nature and, the first man and his rights? Like, and whereas when you start with just an issue that's already a live question for them, like, I don't know what we should do about climate change. Well, now they're motivated to find an answer. And if you can then say, well, look, here's a framework for thinking about that will clarify this issue for you and lead you to an answer, that then is much more motivating than just saying, all right, guys, we're going to question what system we should have. Like, everybody knows what system we should have. And that feeling that, well, everybody knows, it's because they don't appreciate that philosophy is that they are making certain assumptions. And I mean, it's really revealing how philosophy originates. Like, why does it originate in Greece? Well, it's precisely that you start getting a lot of interaction with other cultures, and suddenly things that the Greeks think, well, we all know what gods to pray to. We all know what virtue is, because it's all, right and wrong is something that's just taken for granted. It's a live issue now, because you're saying, oh, other people don't agree. They have completely different political systems, completely different gods, completely different morals and customs and things. Well, hell, how are we going to figure out which ones are true? And so that's kind of, you have to do a lot of work to get people interested and seeing that there's real questions that philosophy is grappling with, and there's a need to grapple with them, because otherwise there's just the sense of, well, we all know X, and philosophy's message is, well, we don't know it. And so it's much easier usually to get them to meet people where they're actively seeking answers rather than when they think the answers are settled. Now, sometimes you have to get them and ultimately, I think you do have to get them to question things that they think are settled. But it's a hard job, and there's a whole art to how you do that.
That's true. And I've often found that it's also illuminating things that they assumed to be true but didn't know why. So when kids get stuck on this, I'll say, you know, well, what makes your car your car? Why can't I take your car? Like what prevents me? Why shouldn't I be able to just hop in your car and drive it home? What makes your car, your phone, because they're actually holding a phone or they have it in their pocket, and they go, well, I bought it with my money. And then we'll start talking about, well, why is it your money? And then we'll get down to the fact that because it's their life and their time, and we can often walk backwards that way. And then they can see. So I think sometimes diving into something that's really close to them, or, doing what Piaget wanted us to do, is talking about something that they know and then building out from that can often help. So I want to, we've been talking now about trying to communicate the message of liberty. And I feel like there was a real revival, a real liberty moment happening in the US, probably around 2008, 2009. And you would know this because you wrote a book called Free Market Revolution. And this was around the time of the Tea Party. You had at this time, a revival of interest in Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand's ideas. I remember Glenn Beck at this point was becoming popular, and he was talking about libertarian ideas. Sometimes he would get them wrong, but at least he was talking about them. You had Ron Paul running for president. You had Paul Ryan talking about Ayn Rand. But I don't know, it just seems as if we've lost that, right? The urgency is gone, I feel. And both sides of the aisle seem to be calling for more government, for more restrictions, for I don't know, for changing the structure of the country so that it punishes the enemy in the short term, even if it winds up leaving us all less free in the long term. I think that's what you're seeing, a lot of that right now. More debt, blow out the budget, higher taxes, civil rights legislation that actually are not about rights. They restrict freedom of association and freedom of speech. So what is going on? Is that little glimmer of a liberty movement, is that over? How are we right now in this? Am I wrong about this, or has this sort of liberty moment kind of passed?
Well, it's definitely passed. And I think there definitely was a moment where people were starting to, because part of what was notable about the Tea Party is, certainly looking back, there were a lot of bad signs and worrisome signs about what was to come. But there was a real interest in fundamental questions. Like there's like people reading the Federalist again, and like you said, reading Ayn Rand, going back to basics and really trying to educate themselves on what is the nature of America, what is the nature of the founding, what makes us special, what is the case for the American way of life, what is the American way of life. And I think that what happened was, in part, that they very quickly settled for the same failed answers that had been offered, for decades. So it was mostly, we'll settle for the same kind of conservative, non-intellectual answers to things. And then part of what was happening at the same time was a resurgent left. And it had been building really since, I think, the early 2000s. But by the time we get to like Occupy Wall Street and these things, once there's a left that's providing a narrative that is explaining how we got to where we are. So like, we have this financial crisis, and there was an attempt to explain it mostly in economic terms, particularly like the Austrian economists got a lot of notoriety after the financial crisis because some of them were predicting it, and they had a kind of account of the economics to explain it. But what the left had was a much wider narrative about what was going on in the world, how the kind of state of America that was not pretty as they were portraying it. And so they had this narrative of, the way they would put it is, look, we had this post-war boom after World War II where we had shared prosperity thanks to high, tax rates on the rich, strong union protections, and egalitarian
Right.
norms that controlled the people at the top. And they said, we threw all that away starting in the 70s, embraced this radical free market fundamentalism because of people like Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan. And then what happened? Inequality took off. The top 1% took all the gains. The rest of us stagnated. And look where it led us, to a financial crisis created by unregulated capitalism. And that is, if you think about how people take in philosophy, it is not through, very rarely is it through sitting in a classroom and reading Plato and discussing Kant or things like that. It's through stories that explain, where are we, how did we get here, and where are we going, and where should we go? And the left had a story, and it was a compelling story, and nobody was answering it. And the right had really nothing to say at this point. Like, if you think about the arguments that were made against Obama, I mean, take Obamacare. It was like, the one that everybody points to is like, get your government hands off my Medicare. But even if you take less silly ones, it's socialism. Okay, but do you have a real account of why we're having problems in healthcare and what the solution is? Or are you just screaming socialism? And they were just screaming socialism. So you have the left that's giving us a story that helps make sense of the world and pointing us in a direction. The right has like nothing to say. And part of what the problem was that the pro-liberty movement, as I said, wasn't very intellectual. The best parts of it were typically solely focused on economics. And economics is important and it's vital, but it's not the full case. So if you have the resurgent left talking not just about economic inequality, but racial inequality, all of the kind of gender issues, that they're now like have a much better story. They're becoming much more forceful. And so part of what happens then is that that the right kind of devolves into a feeling of, we don't have a response to this. Their tribe is winning, so we need to fight back. And I think that's part of the mentality that then leads to Trump, which is, this is a guy who is going to fight back on their terms. And like, we need that right now, because none of this highfalutin talking about ideas that we've been doing forever, that's not working. And that's how they analyzed it. And so, yeah, I think the moment disappeared because of a combination of people weren't really given good intellectual answers on the right. And then they were responding in a tribalistic way to the left.
Right. But one of the hard things is, the people on the left, the story that worked for them, the sort of Robert Reich inequality myth that you guys talk about in Equal is Unfair, that's not a factually accurate story. So that's not a good intellectual answer either. And when the right gives intellectual answers and brings out the charts and talks about, oh, well, you can't do relative prosperity, you have to do absolute prosperity. And it may be that inequality has increased by 18% since 1980, but the poor are better off. Look they have a TV and they have, all of this stuff. They have a PlayStation. The average poor person, Heritage Foundation, has X, Y, and Z things. And that doesn't feel true for a lot of people, even if it is true. So there's a sense in which Trump actually fought back and gave people an answer that was what they felt to be a compelling story, even though you and I would agree that that Trump is a charlatan and it shouldn't be a compelling story. It was for many people. And one of the problems we see now is that the right, at least back in the Tea Party days, if you asked a conservative, a kind of Reagan style small government conservative, what to read, they would point you to Hayek and Friedman and Ayn Rand and Mises and things like that. But today, if you ask that was at least they pretended to care about freedom and limited government and capitalism. They pretended. Now, when you talk to a conservative, or at least the sort of rising sort of new right, I recently wrote an article about these guys. They're talking about Edmund Burke. They're talking about a more European style of conservatism, borders, boundaries, limits, a religiously reordered public square. You have, all these new variants of conservatism that basically think the founding is a joke, that liberty doesn't work. As Patrick Deneen told me when I was interviewing him for my latest Quillette article, he said, the problem with Randian atomized individualism is that people end up being atomized and floundering for help, and then relying on government ever more so because of our atomized individualism. They're lost, they're adrift, they're drug-addled, and they have to depend on the state, and government gets bigger because of atomized individualism. It paradoxically leads to a larger state and more dependency. And what do we say to those people? What do we say to this new right that is populist, that wants progressive economics and social conservatism? And that story seems to be working, even if it is, even if these people are Philistines, and if this is anti-intellectual, the story is more compelling. It directly counters the left's collectivism and imposes a right-wing collectivism that seems to be more potent against the left. Does small government really sell? What do you think about that, Don?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is kind of indicated in your very question, and it's kind of what I was trying to say with why the kind of Tea Party moment failed. It's precisely that there hasn't been a full narrative articulated by genuinely pro-freedom people that actually explains where we are, how we got here, and where we should go. And that's exactly what has to happen. So it's great that people would turn to Rand, and to a lesser extent some of the other figures you mentioned. Now, they often don't take away enough, but part of the issue is, if you look at what people like Rand and Friedman and Hayek and things, part of what they're doing is they were explaining their world. Where are we? How did we get here? Where should we go? And so it can't be that all people have is people trying to understand the 20th century, right? Like, you need a live, or you could think of it as a living framework, a framework that actually talks about the issues that are relevant to today and puts them in perspective. And that has not really been defined fully. Yaron and I tried to, in our books, define aspects of the narrative, but again, our books are more economic. Now, they're not economics books, but they're focused more on the culture, or the kind of flow of the culture from a more economic perspective. So they're not looking at everything that you'd need to look at. So one of the things that I'm very big on, one of the things I'm trying to encourage people to do more of, and there's others in the objectivist orbit working on this as well, including notably Greg Salmieri, who you've interviewed on your show, who are actively working, like, what is the real story of where we are today, how we got here, where we're going. And I think until that happens, then yeah, it's going to be a contest of bad narratives.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. And I don't know. Sometimes I feel cynical. Sometimes reading Ayn Rand is the only thing that makes me feel better. Because, look, you're going to get critics that are going to say to you, Don, look, human beings aren't these Randian heroes. Human beings aren't homo rationalis or homo economicus. People don't behave this way. Let me give you an example. In our democratic system, it's virtually impossible to revoke or repeal or take away so-called entitlements, right? People will always vote for free stuff, even if you and I know it isn't free. And Tonstoffel, there's no such thing as a free lunch. As a political candidate, it just seems doomed from the start. You can't run on a philosophy of fiscal austerity. You can't run on dismantling Social Security or rolling back entitlements. You and I know that the debt is $28 trillion and that we're screwed. But, and I think that's part of why you're kind of an objectivist, is that Ayn Rand takes an approach that is, I know she wouldn't approve of this term, but more spiritual. It has to do with a man's life, right? And it's a value system. It feels like a really personal value system. And sometimes I feel like if libertarians became more objectivist, I think we we could actually have a good liberty message. What do you think that libertarians, liberty-minded conservatives, and people who really do care about freedom, what do you think? And then we'll switch topics. What do you think we can? How do we improve that message? I know you're going to say objectivism, right? How, again, this is a lot like my last question, but how do we tell a better story? What is that story? What specifically is that story, Don?
Well, notice one thing about the kind of, argument that you gave before, which is like Rand is homo economicus, and then people won't overturn the welfare state because they get goodies. But notice that's no, people are purely motivated by getting money with regardless where it came from. It's embracing the very view that it's kind of critiquing. And her view is that people are motivated by values, and that you can have and that if a person has a view of like, no, this is a morally wrong course of action, then they're going to look for a different action. But part of what we're told is not that the worst critique that you get, or let's say the most ambitious critique that you get of the welfare state is, oh, it's unsustainable. But if it's good, then we need to search for how to make it sustainable. And so the view has to be that, no, it's not good. But to have a view that it's not good to have a welfare state or to have a regulatory state, in other words, to have a view that freedom is a positive that we need to be going after, you have to be able to have a real view of what's good. And what has happened traditionally on the free market side is that they don't want to get involved in moral issues. They want to wipe their hands of morality, moral considerations, and you can't do it because at the end, the question is, what's good? And if people think the welfare state is good, then they're not going to jettison it. That's true. If people think the regulatory state is good, they're not going to jettison it. And so there has to be a rethinking of good. And in the end, part of what we argue in free market revolution, and I've tried to indicate at least some of the reasoning here, is that so long as you view what's morally good as, or let me put it in the negative because it's, I think, clear that this is true. As long as you view people on a quest for their self-interest as bad, then you can't support freedom. Because, like, what is the welfare state? It's saying, no, you can't be obsessed with your own interest and your family and the things you care about. You owe a debt to others precisely because you've been successful to whatever degree you've been successful. With the regulatory state, it's if you're free, if you're on a quest for your own interests, you're a threat to everybody else. It's that people left free are going to harm others. Or if you take that kind of conservative view, it's that people left free, people on a quest for happiness, will be unhappy and therefore demand less freedom, right? So all of it comes down to, you need to really have a conception of morality, and it needs to, if you really are interested in freedom, the only conception of morality that's consistent with freedom is a pro-self morality.
That's a really good strategy. That's good advice. So I'm currently reading The Fountainhead, and I'm going to do an episode in about a week on the Fountainhead. And I'm finding it. This is actually my third time reading it. I'm finding it to be even more magical and inspiring than I did when I first read it. Very few authors give their readers a hero, a real hero to look up to, and maybe it's because we are living in an age of cynicism where sincerity and having earnestly held moral views is seen as kind of passé and lame. But I just find the book to be so rejuvenating, and it kind of fills me with energy reading it. And I've been trying to figure out why The Fountainhead has been so inspiring to me. And I think I figured out one of the reasons, which is that it's kind of a manual for how to live in a world that is hostile to your values. Right. It's a story about individualism, certainly, but it's also a kind of guidebook for how to stay true to your values, even when all of the odds are stacked against you. And for an objectivist, for any kind of liberty loving person, especially if you live in New England like me, the odds, it just feels, you constantly feel intellectually lonely. Right. And it also feels like a kind of guidebook for how to survive cancel culture while still keeping your dignity. That's one of the things that I'm going to talk about in that episode. And it reminded me of this Nietzsche quote. And the Nietzsche quote is this: the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. And that's what I take away in many ways from Rand's The Fountainhead. I wanted to ask you, why do you personally think the Fountainhead is an important work? What place? I know every Rand fan has a different like favorite Rand novel. What place does The Fountainhead occupy for you in the canon of Ayn Rand's work? Where would you rank it alongside of her other novels?
I mean, personally, Atlas Shrugged is my favorite, but what is unique about The Fountainhead, and it's part of what is so important about it, is it's very, very sophisticated psychologically, both the psychologically of it, what it means to be an independent person, as you said, in a culture where you're being pushed to conform, a tribal culture where you're being pushed to conform to one side versus another side, but also in understanding the psychology of people we meet every day, from the person who is the conformist, from the avant-garde, so-called non-conformist, to the power luster, to the person who thinks success is impossible. So how do I cope with that feeling it gives you all of these kinds of people that you've met in one form or another. And it gives you really deep insight into their psychology, into what kind of life you'll live if you choose to craft yourself in that direction versus another. So it's so rich in psychology. But and you mentioned the issue of cancel culture. I would put it wider. I think cancel culture is really just a version of living in a tribal culture where people are taught that you need to like choose sides, and then you conform to your side. You don't question, you obey the dogma, because I mean that was really how kind of Trumpism functioned amongst the right, just as wokeism functions among the left. It's Don't you step outside the dogma.
Yep.
And part of what the Fountainhead contends with is that, well, what's the alternative to that? And the alternative is to develop a self. We're not born having a self, and indeed most people don't ever cultivate one, because what it involves and what we see in that novel, without giving obviously any spoilers away, is we see that what it really means in the end is to be a thinker. And a thinker doesn't just mean like you study Newtonian, mechanics and you know how fast like balls drop or something like that. It's that you're a thinker about human values as well as what's true in reality, what's factually true, what kind of scientific sort of truth. You're scientific about your quest for values. And so the way that the hero of The Fountainhead is an architect, and the reason that he finds himself at odds with the crowd is that he has a basic view that, look, I have standards for why I'm an architect and for how to design. And it is that you have a basic idea, a theme that a building is going to be, every decision will be integrated around. And I went to Taliesin West, which is a school that Frank Lloyd Wright started. And you find out like the tour guide's telling me about like the size of these tiles are, based on the kind of ratios of how bricks are laid out on this side of the wall. Everything is unified and integrated towards a single purpose. And what Rourke is encountering is he's designing these buildings with this expression of a theme in a really innovative way. And people want to change his drawings and put a classical facade on something. And his view is, no, that destroys everything I like about building, everything that makes a building good, if you're just throwing some extra stuff on that doesn't integrate around a certain theme. And part of what you get in The Fountainhead is actually in microcosm what it means to build a self and build a life for yourself. It's that every life has a theme. Every life has, this is what I'm about in life. This is what I'm after. And I'm choosing all my values in a way that integrate into this consistent whole that's going to add up to my life and my happiness. Not everybody does that. Not everybody thinks about, what am I after? Why am I after it? How does it fit with how does my career ambitions fit with my romantic values, fit with my friendship, fit with my hobbies, fit with my exercise regimen? I need to put all that together if I really want to build a life. And then I have to think about, well, what are the traits of character that are required in order to live that kind of life? What kind of virtues do I have to cultivate in myself in order to achieve my vision of the best possible life? And it's only a person who does that who has real convictions. And if you have real convictions, then that's what allows you to look at the mob and say, like, no, I'm going to stand against you because I know why what I'm after is good, and I know why what I'm after is true. And if you think about, so Ayn Rand, not in The Fountainhead, though the roots are there. She's a real, she was talking about tribalism back in the 70s. And the part of her view was that tribalism is the default way of human functioning. But what are you defaulting on? You're defaulting on that kind of thinking about what are the convictions and virtues and values that my life is going to consist of. And you're in effect blind. You have not questioned and thought about how you're going to guide your life, and you experience that as being out of control. And out of control is a scary thing for a human being. And when people are fearful, one way of coping with it, the kind of default way of coping with it, is turn to the group. And what happens is people say, look, you tell me what to do. Like, I'm not going to think about my own values and what I want from life. You tell me what to do, but protect me, and I'll obey whatever you say unquestioningly.
Yeah.
And so tribalism is a default that happens when people don't live a Rorkish kind of life. And what the Fountainhead is doing is it's saying, this is this is not all it's doing, but one thing it's doing is saying, this is the antidote to tribalism. It's, you can build this kind of life for yourself, and what it takes is ultimately just thinking.
So for those people who are listening that haven't tuned into this show before, I'm a big fan of the American founding. If I could sum up my political philosophy right now at this point in time, it would be the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. I don't even want to put a label on it beyond the founding, right? The Federalist Papers, maybe Locke's second treatise of government. I'm a big fan of the founding philosophy, and I know you are too. So I wanted to ask you, what makes America special to your mind? For me, America should, well, actually, it's one of my favorite aspects of Atlas Shrugged is when the titans of industry begin shrugging one by one, right? These men of the mind begin dropping out of disappearing out of the system. And it turns out that they're hiding in this isolated valley called Galt's Gulch, I think, if I remember right, where freedom reigns and people can pursue their excellence, and you have property rights and people don't denigrate capitalism. And people pursue their excellence and all of this. In some ways, I really truly feel that America should basically be Galt's Gulch. It should be the Wild West. It should be a place where people with skill and ability, people who create value, are not punished for their values. That's what America really is to me. The world's always going to be filled with countries and regimes that hate liberty, that want to control how people live, that don't want their citizens to be free, that want to preserve some ancient theocratic ideal, right? Or if you're a leftist, right, what Marx called species being, that want to take us back to a kind of time where we exist for the survival of our species and for like this abstract notion of brotherhood. But for me, America is supposed to be different. America is a place where you're allowed to have guns and you're allowed to be a billionaire. And so long story short, what is America to you? What should America be? And maybe at some point you could touch on how the founding philosophy plays into your vision.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. And I mean, I agree with a lot of what you were saying. The way I think about it is, America is the nation of the Enlightenment. It was the last great achievement of the Enlightenment, was a nation founded on the idea that because human beings are creatures of reason, we can conduct and have the right to conduct our own affairs by our own judgment. And that means our political affairs, it means our personal affairs, our intellectual affairs, our economic affairs, that we, each of us, has the right to go on a quest for happiness guided by our own understanding of the world. And that gets embedded in the American system through the Constitution, through the Declaration of Independence, through just the story of the founding of the country. But the Enlightenment didn't have, and I mentioned this earlier, it didn't have an articulated philosophy. So the way that it becomes really embedded in the country beyond those documents and those stories is more what Ayn Rand called a sense of life, which it's kind of like an implicit philosophy. It's a way of coming at the world. And it shows up in those kinds of things, like that can-do attitude, the impatience, like we're focused on worldly success, like time is money, let's get moving, let's be creative, let's be productive, let's solve problems. That if you want to put it as the psychology of
I love that.
America is really the Enlightenment psychology. And so but the problem is that makes you really vulnerable to people who are intellectually sophisticated and want to tear that down. That is, if you can't defend your way of life, if you can't say this is what's special about America, then you can lose it without knowing it. And if you can't say this is why what's special about America is good, then you can't defend it if you try to. And so you need that. And the Ayn Rand viewed her greatest philosophic opponent as Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher writing during the late 18th century. And part of what Kant saw, his whole project was the Enlightenment has failed. And it has failed in the sense that we have this amazing, scientific revolution that's telling us how chemistry works and how physics works and everything like that. And yet we can't defend it because the skeptics have completely knocked everything down. So we have a choice. We have dogmatists who are just kind of like, trying to establish a firm philosophic basis for the Enlightenment, and they can't do it. And then the skeptics, that's a dead end. And the problem, though, is that Kant, though he gets the problem right, he comes up with like the complete opposite of the solution. So he basically says, well, the skeptics are right. We can't actually know anything about real reality, but we can still do science as long as I won't get into the complications of it, but it's science that basically is the rules that govern what's bouncing around in your head. That's not totally fair to Kant, but it is, you're cut off from reality as it really is. And then it is morally, what should you do? Well, you should obey orders that come from that reality that you can't understand, telling you what to do, even though it has no connection to your personal happiness, your personal values, to success and joy on earth. It's just doing your duty because some authority from another realm is commanding it. So it's crushing the Enlightenment focus on reason, on success and happiness in this earth, on and so what you get after Kant is just the complete destruction of the Enlightenment. All of the pro reason, pro this world, pro individual, pro freedom orientation that philosophy had been kind of had been bouncing around in philosophy for like 150 years. That's out, and it's replaced by these deeply irrationalist, collectivist kind of philosophies that emerge in the 20th century. The 19th and the 20th century. And what Ayn Rand is really doing is saying, like, the founders got it right, not in every detail, and certainly not in the implementation of their ideals. So she was very aware, for instance, that, they didn't actually protect the rights of each man who's allegedly born equal, right? So there is becoming more consistent with the ideals, but there's providing a secure basis for the ideals. And so what she's doing, and what I think she successfully does, is provide a firm foundation for reason and for individualism, and that you need that in order then to be able to implement consistently and defend the vision that the founders so incredibly defined and then did as good a job as you could imagine anybody doing for the most part in terms of implementing.
Yeah, and what you were saying was reminding me of a scene. You were talking about the injustices and freedom being applied unequally and things like that. And I was thinking of obviously slavery, and recently reading the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And there's just this uber capitalist moment about 2/3 of the way through. No, it's like about right near the end there, when Douglass escapes from his sort of urban slavery in Baltimore, and he heads up north. And one of the things he's astonished at was that there wasn't slavery, and yet people were still making money. In fact, they were making better money. Everything was shiny and new. The workers looked happy, and he had assumed formerly that, you know, the reason that he had been a slave is because in a society you have to have some slaves, because that's, of course, that would be the most profitable way. But of course, one thing he didn't realize, obviously, because he was held against his will as a slave, was that slavery isn't productive. Slaves aren't productive workers because they're not incentivized to innovate. Or so one of the moments that I was thinking about as you were talking is this moment of revelation and astonishment when Frederick Douglass realizes that capitalism produces wealth, and that the sort of what Eugene Genovese calls the he called the antebellum South a pre-bourgeois aristocracy or something like that. There was just this amazing moment where Frederick Douglass basically realizes, wow, I think I'm a capitalist, right? And one of the ways he comes to that realization is the first moment was when he was a slave and he started working in a shipyard, and he would come back to his master, and his master would let him keep, like, you know, a tenth of his earnings. And for Douglass, that was more insulting than just holding him slave, is that he got to see the reward in his hand, and that you were going to come then and arbitrarily tell him how much he could keep of his money. Anyways, I don't know why I'm rambling about this. Have you ever read the book?
Oh yeah.
Narrative? Great.
Yeah.
Great
I mean,
text.
I think part of what if we think about just the freedom movement or liberty movement, however you want to put it, one thing that has been really good in recent years is that more people from that movement have realized, have talked about the heroism of people like Douglass, and have started to say, like, no, we really need to own these issues like slavery and help people conceptualize, like, what was the relationship between slavery and capitalism, because the anti-capitalists have basically argued, or not basically, they have argued that the whole essence of capitalism is intimately tied to slavery, to racism. And so but even setting that to the side, I mean, his life was just so incredibly inspiring. And I mean, it makes you realize the evil of slavery, because now you hold it concrete in your mind. It was this man, this great man, a man of daring and heroism and moral rectitude and eloquence and insight. We were robbed of how many millions of people who were Douglasses or potential Douglasses. And
Exactly.
And part of it is, it should make you have a more negative view of the founders, not a fundamentally negative one, and not obviously of all of them, because some were consistently anti-slavery their entire lives.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes you think. You can't whitewash the fact that they really did create like a country that protected slavery. And you might think, well, maybe they had to do it or whatever, but it's that, no, like, people like Douglass were robbed of their lives, and we were robbed of the legacy of their achievements. And that needs to be really reckoned with and taken seriously. And then, but it's a question of how you conceptualize it in terms of its relationship to freedom.
Well, yeah, and I always like to tell my students when I'm teaching them natural rights theory, or I'm having my AP students annotate the Declaration of Independence, I don't worship Jefferson, but there's a sense in which I worship the founding ideals.
Right.
It just seems unproductive to hero worship the founders themselves. Although, many of them were upstanding, really incredible people, Adams and Washington and things like that. But it's the ideals, it's the founding ideals, it's the reason that slavery is eventually abolished. Yeah, you can make the argument that the founders didn't feel like they had to preserve slavery in order to preserve the Union or something like that. But yeah, and as you were saying that, I was thinking about the fact that Douglass was so brilliant. And you know who's a good writer on this that I think you would like if you haven't read him already? Timothy Sandifer. Have you heard him?
Yeah,
Yeah,
he has a really good monograph on Douglass. I mean, all of Tim's stuff is interesting, but that one is
yeah.
particularly good. And the well, this is more as an aside, but one of the things I warn people about is if you're kind of wading into the libertarian waters, there's kind of a sect, if you will, or an orientation that tends to be like pro South in the Civil War and just real garbage stuff like anti-Lincoln. And Tim is I agree with his analysis of that period, and I highly recommend his work.
Mm. So great. I have one last question for you, and it's more for my listeners. But I want to just say before I ask you the question, I think your podcast is fantastic, and I just want to publicly recommend it. I think it's a really useful program that you put together. It's called the Don Watkins Show for all of my listeners. If you're interested in what Don has been saying with me here, I think you'll really like Don's show. What I like about it, Don, is that you cover so many bases. You talk about objectivism, you do kind of self-help and self-improvement, which I don't mean that as an insult. I think we actually need, that's super important stuff. I think especially with secular philosophical movements, I think you do need, I think it's one of the reasons Jordan Peterson is so popular, whether you like his ideas or not. I think he's popular because he speaks directly to things that we all care about, and he does self-help stuff, and he's not ashamed of doing self-help stuff. And you, in your podcast, you talk about politics and art and being a creator and public speaking and all of this stuff. And so I just want to recommend your podcast for my listeners. And speaking of that, of my listeners, where would you tell young people, Don, or you know what, let's not just do young people, let's do beginners. Where should newbies start with Ayn Rand? What order would you recommend? And I'm kind of selfishly asking this I'm interested in getting more into objectivism. So how about we do this? I'm a novice. I know a lot about Ayn Rand's ideas, but I'm no expert, right? I wouldn't feel comfortable doing a Q&A about Ayn Rand's ideas. Where should a newbie start? What order should a newbie start reading Ayn Rand? And then maybe go to someone like me. If you're familiar with Ayn Rand's ideas, maybe you read them as a teenager. What would be a good reading order? What would be something for someone like me? I've read all of the novels except for We the Living. How could I learn? What are the best works that I could read to learn more about, to get a more in-depth understanding of objectivism, the philosophy? So can you start, Don, with newbies? What do you start with? What order do you read them in? And then novices or people who are intermediate, who kind of get the philosophy, who've read some of the books, what's the next step to really become more knowledgeable?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer in the sense of my general take on these things is just be really selfish, like what sounds interesting to you. And I think that's usually a good way to follow things. But I'll say a few kind of guidelines. So, I mean, first of all, I think definitely like people should in general start with The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged. Now, I say in general because I didn't, and in part it's because I just didn't read fiction. I wasn't interested in fiction. I was interested in ideas, and I only circled back to them later. And so, if you really just hate fiction, I guess you could put the novels off and you can pick up one of her nonfiction works. But for somebody who's kind of exposed themselves to most of her main writings and really wants to go further, I mean, the main things that I recommend are, first of all, you need to read the book on her whole system of philosophy written by her student and heir, Leonard Peikoff. It's called Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. One of the things I've created, and I'm almost done with now, is I go through section by section of that book and kind of riff on it and clarify some things and help, expand on it, make it easier to digest. It's in effect like if you don't have a book club, that, you get to like have a book club with me. And people have found that really helpful. It's been really helpful for me. And part of what I do there is I bring in a bunch of knowledge from the secondary literature, other courses that have been given, in addition to just my own thinking. So you'll get an exposure to a ton of literature that's out there that would take you several years to probably go through. And some of it you can't even go through because the stuff I learned from, my friends who are experts behind the scenes. So that's kind of like my main sort of recommendation there. Then the only other thing I'll add is one of the great things about learning about Ayn Rand today that's very different from when I was starting was that so much stuff is online and free. I used to pay like sometimes hundreds of dollars for these really incredible courses on her ideas that are now on YouTube. And so basically what I would say is that if you haven't listened to all Leonard Peikoff's courses, and like that is that's key to really getting how to understand Ayn Rand, because there's getting what she says, but part of what you have to realize is um she's she stands in relation to contemporary philosophy and to contemporary just ways of thinking, like Descartes did to the scholasticism of his day. Like, he was not like a scholastic with different conclusions. He was saying your whole way of approaching philosophy is totally wrong. And so part of what is helpful about Leonard's courses, besides elaborating on what Ayn Rand thought, was helping you get how she thought and why it's different from the kind of conventional thinking methods that were inculcated with. So yeah, go into YouTube, type in Leonard Peikoff, and I'm sure you've probably done at least some of that. But
Yeah, a little bit.
those are my main suggestions.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I do have to add one final one. If
Sure.
somebody's
Yeah.
really serious though about getting like deeply in depth into objectivism, the Ayn Rand Institute has the Objectivist Academic Center, and there
Yeah.
you basically get a unparalleled opportunity to study with some of the best minds in objectivism. And for me, it was transformational. For many other people, it's been transformational, including I know people who are not objectivists, though they're sympathetic, who have gone through it and really profited from it. So it's, if you're interested in understanding Ayn Rand, that's like the ultimate place to go.
Good. Okay. Yeah. And I think they have scholarships that you can take advantage of. So if you can't afford it, it's likely that maybe you won't have to pay for it, or you'll get a partial scholarship or something like that. So those are all good suggestions. Thank you so much for joining the program. It was great talking to you and learning from you. And hope we keep in touch.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.